One of the biggest concerns is always the risk of double counting. So if you have a project in one country that's selling its credits to another country, how can you ensure only one country is counting that emissions reduction? So let's say we have a project that's a biodigester facility or a landfill gas facility in Chile. They're generating credits and they're selling those credits to Colombia. Colombia should be the one that is then showing that reduction in their national emissions, not Chile. And so there are some risk along that line. I've actually had some podcasts on this recently. So if y'all want to check out the Future of Trust, we've got some pretty in-depth discussions on this specific topic. But there's that risk to where Chile and Colombia could both count the reduction, and that's not how the market works. It has to be one country or the other. So for the hackathon impetus, the solutions must define at least two jurisdictions from the start. That can be two countries, that can be two different standards. It can be voluntary going to compliance, or compliance going to compliance, or voluntary going to voluntary. On the voluntary side of the market, there's 5 stakeholders. And so I think this is really important if you're trying to build a solution to understand who the users are of the system. There's the originator, which is the project developer. That's the one that's trying to make the positive impact. They have to get their project audited in alignment with the standard. And so the auditor is a third party. They come in and typically go to the facility in person. They look at the facility and understand what's happening. They collect data samples. They go back and they plug it into their spreadsheets, which have the math for the standard in them. And then they're able to calculate the emissions over a year. They then have a verification and a validation report. Those are two different things that they submit to the standard, be it Vera, Gold Standard, or otherwise. And then those standards issue the credits. There are some new ways happening in the market where we have financial institutions like Northern Trust that are actually issuing credits that are regulated by the CFTC as a commodity. So the market is changing pretty rapidly, which means you can get creative. So I would love to see some of the more creative ways that these markets can interact personally. But those are the 3 major stakeholders when it comes to issuing a credit: the project developer / originator, the auditor, also known as a verification and validation body, and the standards, the carbon market standards, or the certifiers, the ones that are actually issuing or listing those credits on the market. After credits are issued, they go to a marketplace or a registry. Some of the standards have their own registries. Some of them offload to other registries. And then there's the off-takers of the purchasers. The off-taker sides, item number 5, is changing pretty rapidly too, because there's secondary markets that are building around credits. There's other financial tools and assets that people are building to try to increase the value of credits. But the goal of the off-taker typically is, I want to buy a credit to reduce my emissions and meet a goal. So they either do that through a marketplace, directly through a standard, or sometimes an off-taker will have a direct agreement with the project developer where they invested in the project early on before it was generating credits. And so that helped them get to the point they could generate credits, and the off-taker gets a percentage of those credits as part of their investment. Or they have a pre-purchase agreement or a forward purchasing agreement or a long-term offtake agreement. So there's a lot of different contracts that you could look to codify into a smart contract for how can an off-taker actually buy credits directly from an originator. And there's a lot of different things we can probably automate here with blockchain and cryptocurrencies that reduce the load and the time that an auditor, a standard, or a marketplace has to perform certain functions. Looking at the regulatory landscape in Latin America, a lot of the countries, as you saw on that map earlier, are developing their own carbon pricing and reporting systems. Everyone has a different kind of approach or rule system. So Colombia has kind of been leading with the carbon tax side of things, which is $4.50 a ton. I'm pretty sure that's up to date, but that allows companies to offset instead of paying a tax. Essentially, if they're over a certain amount, they have to pay that fee per the ton of emissions they generate, unless they're buying credits. And that's kind of created a pretty robust domestic voluntary market. But there's not a lot of systems that interact in the way that this hackathon could support from the voluntary market to the Colombian like compliance market. Chile has a similar tax. It's $5 a ton. They've had it since 2017. I don't believe they enable or allow voluntary credits. They have to be credits that are in country. So nothing outside of country counts in that kind of reduction system. Brazil does not have a carbon tax or ETS yet, but they have the largest number of voluntary projects, over 180 voluntary projects that are generating credits. So very large amount of supply when it comes to like one country supplying the voluntary market. They are looking at a cap and trade law and emissions trading system, but typically the companies are engaged in voluntary markets. So what this really means for hackathon participants, one size is not going to fit all. It's not going to be the same from one country to another or one project to another. So you have to build a system that's pretty flexible, and you need to enable it to account for local laws and local requirements.